The radio crackled with static. Then silence. Complete, suffocating silence. In the command center of Pearl Harbor, a young communications officer stared at his receiver, his hand trembling as he reached for the dial one more time. Nothing. USS Cyclops had vanished. 306 souls gone without a trace, without a distress call, without a single piece of wreckage. The Pacific Ocean had swallowed them whole, and somewhere in those dark waters, the truth waited. This was 1943, and it was about to happen again. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The disappearance of naval vessels during World War II wasn't just about ships going down in battle. It was about something far more unsettling. These weren't casualties of war in the traditional sense. These were vessels that simply ceased to exist, leaving behind nothing but questions, grieving families, and intelligence officers who would spend decades trying to piece together what happened in those final moments. The United States Navy, the most powerful maritime force the world had ever seen, was losing ships and men to an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't understand. And the most terrifying part? It kept happening. Let's go back to where this story really begins. March 1918. The USS Cyclops, a massive collier vessel, departed from Barbados carrying a cargo of manganese ore and 306 crew members under the command of Lieutenant Commander George Worley. The ship was headed to Baltimore. It never arrived. For years, this disappearance remained one of the greatest maritime mysteries in American naval history. But when World War II erupted, the Navy began to notice a disturbing pattern. Ships were vanishing in the same waters under similar circumstances and always without warning. Commander James Reeves sat in his office at Naval Intelligence in Washington, D.C., surrounded by files that officially didn't exist. It was August 1943, and he'd been assigned to a task force that no one talked about, investigating what the Navy internally called the phantom losses. Reeves was a veteran of the First World War, a submariner who'd seen action in the Atlantic, and he'd been chosen for this assignment precisely because he understood that the ocean kept secrets. He spread the reports across his desk. USS Proteus, USS Nereus, both colliers, both sister ships to the Cyclops. Both disappeared in the Caribbean within weeks of each other in 1941, just as America was being pulled into the war. Both carried cargo vital to the war effort. Both vanished completely. 3 sister ships, Reeves muttered to himself, lighting his 5th cigarette of the hour. All gone. All in the same waters. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. But the Navy brass didn't want to hear about patterns. They wanted answers, and they wanted those answers to point away from enemy action. The alternative was too frightening to consider. If German U-boats were operating that close to American shores, sinking vessels without leaving evidence, it meant the Atlantic wasn't as secure as they'd been telling the public. It meant the enemy was closer than anyone wanted to admit. Would you have made the same choice? Would you have kept digging, even when your superiors ordered you to classify the files and move on? Reeves didn't have that luxury, because in September 1943, another ship disappeared. This time, it was different. This time, there were witnesses. The USS Doris Miller, a destroyer escort named after the Pearl Harbor hero, was conducting anti-submarine patrols off the coast of Florida. On the night of September 14th, the destroyer USS Bristol was operating in the same area, running dark to avoid detection. At 2300 hours, Bristol's radar operator picked up a contact. It was the Doris Miller, right where she was supposed to be. The radar operator logged it. 30 minutes later, the contact was gone. Lieutenant Edward Morrison was the officer of the deck on the Bristol that night. Years later, in classified testimony that wouldn't be declassified until 2003, he described what he saw. "I had her in visual range," Morrison stated. "She was maybe 3 miles off our starboard bow, running lights off, just like us. I watched her for maybe 20 minutes. Then I went below to check a navigation chart. When I came back, she was gone. Not sinking, not on fire, just gone, like someone had erased her from the ocean." The Bristol immediately moved to investigate. They found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no survivors, no bodies. 318 American sailors had simply ceased to exist. The Navy launched an investigation that lasted 6 months. They combed through every possibility: submarine attack, internal explosion, structural failure, enemy mine. Every theory led to a dead end because every theory required evidence, and there was no evidence to find. Commander Reeves requested permission to visit the families of the missing sailors. Permission was denied. He requested access to German U-boat logs captured during raids in the Atlantic. Permission denied. He requested authorization to interview the crew of the Bristol under conditions that would allow them to speak freely without fear of disciplinary action. Denied again. The Navy was shutting him down, and Reeves understood why. The truth was more dangerous than the mystery. But Reeves was Navy through and through, and he knew that somewhere in those files, in those testimony transcripts, in the weather reports and tidal charts and patrol logs, there was an answer. American sailors deserved better than to be forgotten as statistical anomalies. Have you ever wondered what it's like to search for ghosts? To chase shadows across an ocean that gives up nothing? The pattern Reeves discovered was chilling in its precision. Every disappearance occurred in what sailors were starting to call the Devil's Triangle, a region of the Atlantic stretching from Florida to Bermuda to Puerto Rico. Every disappearance happened during periods of unusual magnetic activity. Every disappearance involved vessels carrying strategic materials or personnel. And every disappearance occurred when the moon was new, when the night was darkest, when visibility was nearly zero. In December 1943, Reeves compiled his findings into a report that ran 73 pages. He titled it "Anomalous Maritime Losses in the Western Atlantic, a Pattern Analysis." He included meteorological data, astronomical charts, cargo manifests, crew rosters, radio transcripts, and radar logs. He included eyewitness testimony from survivors of near misses, sailors who'd been on vessels that had encountered strange phenomena but lived to report it. He included interviews with Coast Guard pilots who'd flown search and rescue missions and found nothing where something should have been. The conclusion was unavoidable. These weren't random tragedies. Something was hunting American ships in the Atlantic, and it was doing so with precision and purpose. Reeves submitted his report through proper channels. It went to Naval Intelligence, then to the Office of Naval Operations, then to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. 2 weeks later, he was reassigned to a training facility in San Diego. The report was classified top secret and buried so deep that it wouldn't surface for 60 years. But the disappearances didn't stop. Flight 19 took off from Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station on December 5, 1945. 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, 14 men total, led by Lieutenant Charles Taylor, an experienced pilot with 2,500 hours of flight time. It was supposed to be a routine training mission. 2 hours into the flight, Taylor radioed the tower. "We are not sure of our position. We cannot be sure where we are. We seem to be off course." The tower responded immediately. "What is your position?" Taylor's voice came back, confused, almost panicked. "We don't know where we are. We think we must be about 225 miles northeast of base. It looks like we are entering white water. We're completely lost." White water? In the middle of the Atlantic? At 2,000 feet altitude? Is that bravery, continuing to fly when nothing makes sense, when your instruments are lying and your training is failing? The tower tried to guide them back. For the next hour, radio operators listened as Taylor and his squadron became increasingly disoriented. Compasses spinning, altimeters malfunctioning, nothing working the way it should. At 1600 hours, Taylor made his final transmission. All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together. Then, silence. The Navy launched the largest air and sea search in its history. 300 aircraft, 21 ships, 4,000 square miles of ocean grid searched for 5 solid days. They found nothing, not a life raft, not a piece of fuselage, not a drop of oil. 14 American aviators gone. And then, as if to mock the search effort, one of the rescue planes vanished too. A Martin Mariner flying boat with a crew of 13 disappeared while searching for Flight 19. No distress call, no wreckage, just gone. Commander Reeves, now teaching navigation to midshipmen in California, read about Flight 19 in the newspaper. He sat in his small apartment that night, pulled out a map, and marked the location where the squadron was last heard from. Right in the heart of the Devil's Triangle. Right where every other disappearance had occurred. He wrote a letter to Naval Intelligence, requesting to be reinstated to active investigation duty. The letter was never answered. But here's what Reeves had discovered, what he documented in that buried report, what the Navy didn't want the public to know. The disappearances weren't random, they weren't caused by enemy action, they were environmental. The Devil's Triangle sits atop one of the deepest trenches in the Atlantic, a region where magnetic anomalies are common, where methane deposits can suddenly release and reduce water density, causing ships to sink in seconds, where unusual atmospheric conditions can create electromagnetic interference that scrambles every instrument on a plane or ship, where the Gulf Stream can carry wreckage hundreds of miles away from where it entered the water. The Navy knew this. They'd known it since 1943. But they couldn't admit it, because admitting it meant admitting they'd sent American sailors and pilots into a region of ocean that was inherently dangerous, that was a natural death trap, and they did it anyway, because the war effort demanded it. Strategic shipping lanes ran through the triangle. Training routes crossed it. There was no way to avoid it without disrupting operations that were critical to winning the war. So they kept sending ships. They kept sending planes, and men kept disappearing. Would you have spoken up? Would you have risked your career, maybe even court-martial, to tell the truth? Petty Officer Samuel Grant was a radar technician aboard the USS Solomons, an escort carrier operating in the Caribbean in early 1945. On the night of February 7th, Grant was manning his station when he picked up a strange contact. It was moving fast, too fast for any known vessel. It appeared on his screen, held steady for maybe 30 seconds, then vanished. Grant reported it to the officer of the deck. The officer told him to log it as a glitch. But Grant knew his equipment. He knew what a glitch looked like. This wasn't a glitch. For the next 3 nights, the same contact appeared, always at the same time, always moving at impossible speed, always vanishing after 30 seconds. On the 4th night, Grant convinced the officer of the deck to alter course, to move away from the area where the contact was appearing. The officer, a young lieutenant named Robert Chen, agreed. They altered course by 20 degrees. That night, the contact didn't appear. 3 days later, they received word that a destroyer, the USS Frederick C. Davis, had been sunk by a German U-boat in the exact area where Grant's mysterious contact had been appearing. The Davis went down with heavy casualties. If Grant and Chen hadn't altered course, the Solomons might have been next. Grant never reported the full details of what he'd seen. He couldn't explain it, and he knew no one would believe him anyway. But years later, in his 80s, he gave an interview to a naval historian. Something was out there, Grant said, something that wasn't showing up the way it should. Maybe it was a new type of submarine. Maybe it was something else. But I know what I saw on that radar screen, and I know it saved our lives. The American spirit isn't just about fighting, It's about asking questions when things don't make sense. It's about trusting your instincts even when everyone else tells you you're wrong. Commander Reeves never got his answers. He retired from the Navy in 1952, took a job teaching history at a small college in Connecticut, and spent his final years compiling his own private research on the disappearances. When he died in 1967, his wife donated his papers to the Naval Historical Center. They sat in storage for 36 years before a graduate student stumbled across them while researching something else entirely. That's when the story finally began to come out. The Navy's official position, even today, is that the disappearances were the result of enemy action, mechanical failure, human error, or natural disasters. They acknowledge that the Devil's Triangle has unusual characteristics, but they stop short of saying those characteristics are responsible for the losses. They can't, because saying that would open them up to liability claims from thousands of families who lost loved ones in those waters. But here's what we know now. Here's what declassified documents, survivor testimony, and modern oceanographic research has revealed. The Devil's Triangle is a perfect storm of natural hazards. Deep trenches where ships can sink beyond recovery. Methane vents that can cause sudden buoyancy loss. Magnetic anomalies that scramble navigation equipment. Weather patterns that change in minutes. And during World War II, when those hazards were combined with the stress of combat operations, the need for radio silence, the pressure to maintain speed and course despite dangerous conditions, the result was inevitable. Ships and planes were going to disappear, and they were going to do so in ways that left no trace, no evidence, no closure for the families left behind. The USS Cyclops, Proteus, and Nereus were probably victims of structural failure combined with sudden storms. They were overloaded with cargo, their hulls stressed beyond design limits, and when they encountered heavy seas, they simply broke apart and sank before anyone could send a distress signal. The depth of the water meant they vanished into trenches thousands of feet deep, places where wreckage would never be found. Flight 19 was likely disoriented by magnetic interference that caused their compasses to malfunction. They flew in circles, burning fuel, until they had no choice but to ditch in the ocean, at dusk, in rough seas, with no one knowing their real position. They probably survived the initial ditching, but in that water, in those conditions, survival time was measured in minutes. The Martin Mariner that went down looking for them likely suffered a mid-air explosion, a known hazard with that aircraft model due to fuel vapor buildup. It would have disintegrated on impact, leaving nothing to find. The USS Doris Miller probably struck a mine, or was hit by a torpedo from a U-boat that was never detected, never engaged, and never reported its success. The explosion would have been catastrophic, sinking the ship in seconds, in deep water, at night, with no survivors to tell the tale. These weren't mysteries, they were tragedies. They were the inevitable result of sending men into one of the most dangerous regions of ocean on Earth during wartime with technology that wasn't advanced enough to detect the hazards they were facing. But here's the thing about American sailors and pilots. They knew the risks. They understood that every time they left port, every time they took off from that runway, they might not come back. And they went anyway. Because that's what the mission required. That's what victory demanded. That's what freedom cost. Commander Reeves understood that. It's why he kept investigating even when the Navy told him to stop. It's why he compiled his research, preserved his findings, made sure that someday someone would piece together the truth. Not to embarrass the Navy, not to create conspiracy theories, but to honor the men who disappeared. To make sure their service, their sacrifice, wasn't forgotten or dismissed as administrative errors. Samuel Grant understood it too. He trusted his equipment, trusted his training, and made a decision that saved his ship and his crew. That's American ingenuity in action. That's the resourcefulness and courage that won the war. And Lieutenant Edward Morrison, who watched the Doris Miller vanish from the ocean, who testified about what he saw, even though it made no sense, even though it sounded impossible, he understood that the truth, no matter how strange or unsettling, matters more than comfortable lies. Could anyone else have pulled this off? Could any other nation have maintained operations in those waters despite the losses, despite the mysteries, despite the fear? The answer is no, because the American Navy didn't run from the unknown. They didn't avoid the Devil's Triangle. They studied it, they learned from it, and they developed procedures and technologies that made it survivable. Modern ships have multiple redundant navigation systems. Modern aircraft have satellite communications that can transmit position data continuously. Modern search and rescue operations use sonar and deep-sea submersibles that can locate wreckage miles beneath the surface. But in World War II, when the Navy had no choice but to operate there, they paid the price. But here's what that price bought: victory in the Atlantic, uninterrupted supply lines to Europe, training grounds for pilots and sailors who would go on to fight in the Pacific, strategic positioning that denied those waters to the enemy. The men who disappeared in the Devil's Triangle didn't die in vain. They died doing their duty, maintaining operations in a region that was critical to Allied success. That's not a mystery. That's heroism. That's the American Navy at its finest, accepting losses, learning from them, and continuing the mission anyway. Today, if you visit the Naval Memorial in Washington, D.C., you'll find the names of thousands of sailors and Marines who were lost at sea during World War II. Many of those names belong to men who disappeared in the Devil's Triangle. Their families donated photographs, letters, service records. The memorial doesn't list how they died. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they served. What matters is that they answered the call. What matters is that when their country needed them to sail into dangerous waters, they went. And they're not forgotten. Not by the Navy, not by historians, not by anyone who takes the time to understand what really happened in those waters during the war. The mystery of the disappearances isn't really a mystery at all. It's a reminder that the ocean is powerful and unforgiving. A reminder that war demands sacrifice. A reminder that freedom comes at a cost, and that cost is paid by men and women who volunteer to stand between their country and danger, knowing full well they might not come home. Commander Reeves spent 20 years trying to solve a mystery that didn't need solving. The Navy already knew what had happened. They just couldn't say it. But his work wasn't wasted. Because when his files were finally declassified, when researchers could finally piece together the full story, those families who'd waited decades for answers finally got them. Not the answers they wanted, not closure that eased the pain, but truth. Real, documented, verified truth about what happened to their loved ones. And that truth is this: they were American sailors and pilots who went where they were ordered, did what was required, and paid the ultimate price. They weren't victims of mysterious forces or supernatural phenomena. They were casualties of war, fighting an enemy that included not just submarines and aircraft, but the ocean itself. That's worth remembering. That's worth honoring. That's worth ensuring we never forget. These stories remind us why courage matters and why freedom was never free. Subscribe now and join us again for more untold tales of World War II.